You've heard that claiming Social Security at 62 gives you a permanent 30% haircut. That part is true, and it's the piece almost every retirement article already tells you. Here's the piece they leave out. If you're divorced and you were married for at least 10 years, the age your ex-spouse chooses for their own benefit can permanently shrink the survivor check you'll one day collect. You don't get a vote in that decision. They could remarry, move across the country, never speak to you again, and their claiming age still reaches forward and touches your income for the rest of your life. That's one of 3 traps standard advice skips over. The second is a tax rule from the 1980s and 1990s that was never adjusted for inflation, and it quietly pulls more of your Social Security into taxable income every year that goes by. The third is what I'd call the go-go decade paradox, where the advice to delay and maximize your monthly check can cost you the very years you're healthy enough to actually use the money. If I were claiming Social Security again, knowing what I know now, I wouldn't follow the standard playbook by itself. I'd build a plan that accounts for all 3 of these at once, because none of them show up on the SSA's benefit estimate screen. If you're between 55 and 65 and you don't want to leave money on the table, or lose money to a rule you never saw coming, stay with me. Subscribe now, because this channel is where I break down exactly how these pieces fit together. The first trap is the tax torpedo, and here's the shape of it. If you're married and filing jointly, once your provisional income crosses $44,000, up to 85% of your Social Security benefit becomes taxable income. That threshold was set by law in 1993, and it has never been adjusted for inflation since. Provisional income isn't just your paycheck or your pension. It's your adjusted gross income, plus any tax-exempt interest, plus half of your Social Security benefit. Add those 3 together, and that's the number the IRS compares against the threshold. And that $44,000 line isn't the only one working against you. There's a lower threshold, too, set back in 1983. Between $32,000 and $44,000, half of your benefit is already being pulled into taxable income. So by the time you cross the second line, you're not starting from zero, you're adding on top of a number that was already climbing. Here's where it gets expensive. A Roth conversion, or a required minimum distribution from a traditional IRA, adds directly to that provisional income number. Cross the threshold by even a modest amount, and you're not just paying tax on the withdrawal itself. You're also pulling more of your Social Security into the taxable column at the same time. Researchers who study this, including William Reichenstein, call it the tax torpedo, because your effective marginal tax rate can spike past 40% in that zone, well above your regular bracket. I've watched people run this exact math for the first time and go quiet. Not because the numbers are complicated, but because nobody warned them that Social Security could ever be taxed like ordinary income in the first place. Picture a couple with $32,000 in combined income before Social Security gets added in. Their benefit adds enough that half of it, around $10,000, becomes taxable, since they're sitting right at that first threshold. Now add a $15,000 Roth conversion on top. Provisional income jumps past $44,000, and instead of $10,000 of their benefit being taxed, it's closer to $17,000 all, from one extra withdrawal they made on purpose. If you've been doing Roth conversions while collecting Social Security without checking this number, there's a real chance you're paying more tax than you need to, and most people don't find out until they see the bill. Here's the cost most people don't factor in. Converting more now to avoid required minimum distributions later can quietly cost you thousands of dollars in Social Security taxation you would never have owed otherwise. The tax torpedo is something you can at least see coming if you know to look for it. The second trap is different because it depends entirely on someone else's decision, one you have no control over at all. The second trap only applies if you're divorced, but if it applies to you, it's worth understanding fully. Picture Linda, 63, divorced after 12 years of marriage. She planned to claim her own benefit first, then switch over to her ex-spouse's survivor benefit at 67. It's a reasonable plan. It's also missing one piece. Her ex-spouse claimed his own benefit at 62. His full retirement age amount, his PIA, was $2,000 a month. Claiming at 62 cut that down to $1,400, a 30% reduction, permanently. Here's the part almost nobody explains correctly, including some financial advisors. Linda's eventual survivor benefit isn't simply frozen at that reduced $1,400 number. There's a floor built into the rule, sometimes called the widow's limit, and it guarantees her at least 82.5% of what he would have received at his full retirement age. In this case, that floor lifts her benefit up to $1,650. So Linda doesn't lose everything her ex-spouse gave up by claiming early. But she doesn't get the full $2,000 either. She's left with a permanent gap of $350 a month, about the size of a car payment, disappearing every month for the rest of her life. Over a 20-year widowhood that adds up to roughly $84,000 she never gets back. And the only reason that gap exists is a decision her ex-spouse made years earlier, one she had absolutely no say in. The floor exists because Social Security doesn't want a survivor's entire retirement capped by someone else's early filing decision. But it's a partial protection, not a full one, and that nuance is exactly what standard advice glosses over. The part that's easy to miss isn't the dollar loss itself. It's that most divorced women and men plan their retirement around a survivor number they assume is fixed, when in reality it's tied to a choice someone else already made, sometimes decades before either of them thought about it. I used to think the advice to wait until 70 for maximum benefits applied to everyone equally. I was wrong about that. If you're relying on a divorced survivor benefit, your ex-spouse's decision already shaped your outcome, and no amount of waiting on your part changes their number. One requirement worth knowing here. This rule only applies if the marriage lasted at least 10 years. Below that, there's no survivor claim on an ex-spouse's record at all. And there's another wrinkle. If Linda remarries before she turns 60, she loses access to that survivor benefit entirely, even the reduced version. Remarrying at 60 or later doesn't cost her that benefit. It's one more decision, layered on top of her ex-spouse's, that can quietly reshape the number she ends up living on. This isn't a rare situation either. Divorce later in life has become common for this generation, and a lot of people are now hitting the age where survivor benefits start to matter. If you were married a decade or more and haven't remarried, this rule likely applies to you, whether you've thought about it or not. So, if you're divorced, the standard advice about waiting until 70 doesn't tell the whole story. There's a third trap, and this one has nothing to do with tax law or marriage rules. It's about what happens to your body and your bank account in the same decade. The third trap is the one that has the least to do with paperwork and the most to do with being human. Financial planners sometimes call the years between 60 and 70 the go-go decade, because that's typically when people are healthiest and most able to travel, visit grandkids, or just enjoy time without a work schedule. Standard advice says delay claiming until 70 whenever you can, because your monthly check grows by roughly 8% for every year you wait past full retirement age. That's real, and for plenty of people, it's the right call. But it assumes something that isn't guaranteed, that you'll still be healthy enough at 70 to use the extra money the way you imagined back at 62. I've seen this happen with my own uncle. He waited until 70 to claim, exactly like the calculators told him to. He had a heart attack at 71, and the extra monthly income he'd planned around barely got used the way he'd pictured it. There's a flip side, too. Plenty of people delay, stay healthy well into their 80s, and end up glad they waited, because a bigger check for 20 or 25 years adds up. The point isn't that delaying is wrong. The point is that health isn't something you can schedule the way you schedule a claiming date. Think about how this shows up in ordinary decisions. Someone who claims at 62 might use that money to finally take a trip they've put off, or help cover a grandchild's tuition while they're still around to see it matter. Someone who delays might be optimizing a number on a benefit statement that, if their health changes, they never fully get to enjoy. This isn't an argument against delaying. It's an argument against delaying blindly, as if health and income were two separate math problems, when for people in their 60s, they're really the same problem. If you're healthy at 62 and cash poor, wanting to claim early isn't a mistake. It's a reasonable response to a trade-off the standard playbook never says out loud. None of this is about ignoring the math. It's about weighing the math against something the math can't measure, which is how many healthy years you actually have left to spend that money the way you want to. One way to think about it: claiming early is a bit like giving yourself a liquidity loan. You're trading a larger check later for cash and time now, while you can still use both. That's a valid choice, as long as you understand what you're giving up in exchange, and you're making the trade on purpose instead of by accident. So how do you actually decide between waiting and claiming early, especially with a tax torpedo and a survivor rule both sitting in the background? It comes down to one framework that puts all three pieces together. Here's the framework I'd use if I were claiming again, and it has three levers that move together instead of one at a time. Lever 1 is your claiming age. If you have enough savings outside of Social Security to cover your expenses from 62 to 70, delaying can make sense. If you don't have that cushion, claiming early and using the money during the years you're healthiest is a legitimate choice, not a failure. If your bridge amount, the gap between 62 and 70, comes out to something like $180,000 in living expenses, and you've got $200,000 sitting in savings or a brokerage account outside your retirement plan, delaying is probably realistic. If that same $200,000 is actually sitting inside a traditional IRA, spending it down early creates its own tax bill, so the source of the cushion matters as much as the size of it. Lever 2 is Roth conversions, and this is where the tax torpedo from earlier comes back into play. In the years between when you retire and when Social Security starts, or even after it starts, you can convert money from a traditional IRA into a Roth IRA. The goal is to fill up the lower tax brackets on purpose, without spilling over into the provisional income thresholds that make your Social Security taxable. For 2026, married couples filing jointly sit in the 12% bracket up to about $99,600 of taxable income. Converting enough to use that bracket without going further is often the sweet spot. Lever 3 is managing your required minimum distributions before they even start. Right now, RMDs begin at 73 if you were born between 1951 and 1959, and at 75 if you were born in 1960 or later. Every dollar you've already converted to a Roth is a dollar that won't show up later as a forced RMD, pushing up your provisional income and dragging more of your Social Security into taxable territory. Picture a couple with $100,000 in a traditional IRA and $20,000 in taxable savings outside it. They convert $15,000 a year for 5 years, staying inside that lower bracket the whole time. By the time RMDs start, their remaining IRA is smaller, their forced withdrawals are smaller, and their Social Security stays mostly untaxed, because their provisional income never crosses that $32,000 line in the first place. Compare that to a couple who does nothing and lets the entire $100,000 sit in the traditional IRA until RMDs force the issue. Their required withdrawals arrive all at once, taxed as ordinary income, and stacked directly into their provisional income calculation. The couple who converted gradually spread that same tax bill across 5 years at a lower rate and kept their Social Security mostly untouched the whole time. I don't know every detail of your situation, your other income, your health, your family history. What I can tell you is that this framework gives you a structure to run your own numbers against, instead of guessing at it. But every piece of this only works if you actually have the liquidity to pay tax on a conversion in the first place. What if you don't have that kind of cash sitting around? So here's how to actually put this into practice, especially if you don't have a big cash cushion sitting outside your retirement accounts. Step 1. If you're divorced, find out your ex-spouse's claiming age. The SSA can tell you what you're entitled to as a divorced spouse or survivor, and it's worth asking before you build a retirement plan around a number that might already be locked in by their decision. Most people are surprised to learn the SSA will share this, even though it feels like it should be private. It isn't private in this context because your benefit calculation depends directly on it. And if you're still working while an ex-spouse has already claimed, remember your own future benefit and any survivor calculation are two separate numbers. Handling one well doesn't automatically fix the other, so it's worth checking both instead of assuming the bigger one will cover for the smaller one. Step 2. Calculate your bridge amount. Add up what you'd spend from 62 to 70. Subtract any other guaranteed income and see what's left. If you've got at least 2 years of expenses sitting in cash or safe accounts, delaying becomes a realistic option instead of a stretch. Step 3. If you don't have that cash, there's nothing wrong with claiming at 62. Just be intentional about it. Earmark that income for the years and experiences it's meant for, rather than letting it quietly get absorbed into everyday spending. Step 4. If you do have the cash, consider Roth conversions every year, but keep your provisional income under $32,000 if you're married, or $25,000 if you're single, for as long as that's realistic, so you're not accidentally triggering that first tax torpedo threshold. Here's a mistake I see often. People think they need to convert an entire IRA before they die. You don't. Converting just enough to fill the lower brackets each year and leaving the rest where it is tends to work better over time, especially if some of that money is meant for other purposes down the road. For 2026, married couples filing jointly sit in the 10% bracket, up to about $24,800 of taxable income, then the 12% bracket, up to roughly $99,600. Filling those brackets deliberately, year by year, usually beats one large conversion all at once. None of these 4 steps require guessing. They require pulling a few real numbers and making one decision at a time, instead of one big decision made in the dark. So to recap, the tax torpedo, the divorced survivor trap, and the go-go decade paradox are the 3 pieces standard Social Security advice tends to skip over. The fix isn't one decision, it's coordinating your claiming age, your Roth conversions, and your required minimum distributions together. If you don't have the liquidity to delay, that's not a failure on your part, it's just a different starting point. Be smart about how you use the money you do claim. If you're between 55 and 65 and you want more of this kind of breakdown, subscribe and tell me in the comments which of these 3 traps you hadn't heard about before.